Welcome back, everybody, to our first fall session of our Views from the Field episodes. And when I think of these episodes as a project, they're a bit of a snapshot in time. And in this time, September 11th, 2022, we're 21 years past the tragedy at the World Trade Center. We're 3 days post the death of Queen Elizabeth, and we are still in the middle of a pandemic. So this snapshot at this time is definitely capturing the full catastrophe. Today is a very, very special episode. Our dear friend, my dear friend and colleague and wonderfully wise mindfulness teacher and doctor, Patricia Luck, is joining us as our guest teacher. So a heartfelt thank you, Trish. Welcome.
Thanks, Alan. Wonderful to be here. You are, hard to ever know how to say this sentence. You are one of the longest, not oldest, longest MBSR teacher that I have had the joy of being friends with all these years. And it's just delightful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a dear, deep friendship too. Thank you. In way of a very brief introduction, because there's so much, I'd just like to mention that you've had a past practice as a family physician in palliative care and medicine. Was that primarily in South Africa, in your time in South Africa?
It was. I did most of my university training and clinical work in South Africa. I had a brief 4 years when I was an intern and early doctor in Australia, but most of my clinical practice has been in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you. And now you're currently teaching faculty at the University of Rochester Medicine and Dentistry Department of Health, Humanities, and Bioethics. So
I am my fifth recreation of my medical career at the moment. It keeps changing. I'm a chameleon of many spots.
Yeah, and they're lucky to have you. And you continue in facilitating MBSR and mindful practice programs for physicians, within the healthcare field for faculty, students, and community members. And I love this. You had written that you are deeply committed to cultivating our innate capacity to be present to and intimate with the cacophony of human suffering. I just want to pause for a moment on that. It's so much there that touches me, our innate capacity to be present to and intimate with, not just present to, but intimate with the cacophony of human suffering, which we certainly see personally and all around us, encountered in a variety of complex settings, especially within healthcare, which you've spent your life in and are currently working with at the University in Rochester. So I'm leaving out a very distinguished resume of a career that has been dedicated to that statement. And some of what's being left out perhaps will be recounted as we go. But first, I want to mention our meeting, which I was blessed with the opportunity to meet you as we participated in the 2004 MBSR teacher training practicum at the UMass Center for Mindfulness. And that's where our friendship and collegiate activity began. Do you have any anecdotes from that time?
you're asking an old brain to pull out a lot of memories about that. But, when you ask me what comes to mind really quickly is you and I just sitting at the end of the training. So it'll be, 20 years ago in a couple of years. And what deeply stays with me from that time is the importance of community, the importance of really building community, not just for ourselves, but as MBSR teachers. We were sitting, and I still have that visual image by the elevators, waiting. I was waiting for a ride to the airport. I can't remember what you were doing waiting, but we were one of the last there, and just sitting on a bench talking about how to stay connected going forward, and kind of dreaming up a community group for our Sangha from that time, which actually stayed closely in contact for many years. We even as a group had a fair bit of suffering. We've had a fair bit of death and illness from those participants in the group that we experienced together and supported one another over the years. And I think that's something that stays deeply with me, and something that I would offer to other MBSR teachers, the importance of connection and community. And here we are all these years later, still in community together.
Yeah, thank you. These trainings are very bonding times, and I think especially the ones we went through back then. Definitely, we've all stayed together, which is such a blessing. Wonderful. So beginning as far back as you would like to recount, how or where did your path into the fields of medicine and mindfulness practice begin?
Yeah. Like many things in my life, a door opened and I stepped through it, or an invitation happened. And but I guess for me, it grew out of an experience of restlessness and disconnect, and one that I think that's where my interest in staying close to suffering comes from, is my own experience, not necessarily directly great suffering in my own life, even in my own childhood, but suffering that I experience as transgenerational suffering that has come up for me again and again because of experiences of my families. And so I stepped into this work, I think, because I was very restless and disconnected, having a midlife crisis, perhaps, and trying to look at how to direct my medical career. And I had taken some time out and did a short mind-body training where mindfulness was as a brief introduction at that time, and started introducing it to my patients. And when I'd ask them what they resonated with in the new work that I was doing with them, it was my patients that said, this little thing you're doing with the breath and attention to the breath, that's all I knew, was a short breath practice. This is helpful for us. This you need to go and learn more about. So it's really in listening to my patients that I was directed to do MBSR training, teaching. I looked for an MBSR program in South Africa at that time. There was only one being taught in Cape Town. I was living in Johannesburg, so I had to actually get down to Cape Town once a week to do an 8-week. This was before online training was an option. I had to travel with 3 small children at home and a work life. I traveled once a week to do an 8-week program. And I came to the very first conference here in the US, where I met a whole lot of other colleagues and really started doing this work for myself, for my patients, and at the same time became also interested in palliative medicine and palliative care. And so for me, this connection between end-of-life care and mindfulness practice. So staying close in with death and dying and suffering is intimately related and important. I was seeking to really connect my head to my heart, if I remember. And that's why I'm very much in all my guidance, I'm always embodied embodying myself in practice. And that's really where it began.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask you something about palliative care from a Jack Kornfield quote that came across in an email last week. He said, in the end, just three things matter. And perhaps you're familiar with this. How well we have lived, how well we have loved, and how well we have learned to let go. I think as I age, and I see a lot of aging around me within my friends. Do you have any thoughts around that ability of letting go towards the end of life?
I think we face endings in every moment, right? If we're going to wait for our endings at the end of life, we might have missed the teachings and the work. And what I learned really from my work in palliative care is not to wait to live, and to really live now. Regardless of our spiritual teachings and practices, we only have this life now in this moment, and we cannot predict what the next moment will be. So letting go of all that doesn't serve us in this moment is an ongoing practice that, of course, does not make it easy. And it's the letting go in sometimes unexpected ways. One of the reasons I found that my mindfulness practice helped me so very strongly in my palliative care work was the attitude of non-attachment, of not being attached to this moment needing to be in any particular way, not needing, even for the patients that I was working with, not needing their dying or their suffering or whatever they were experiencing to be in any particular way, that I can show up and do the work that's needed in this moment. I'm not having an expectation that's forcing this moment differently. Of course, I have skills, I have plans, I have capacity, I have a whole host of a whole skill set I can bring. But I do not need this moment to be different. I can step into this moment and be with the depth of its suffering and not need to turn away. And that's true for us, whether we do small S suffering or big S suffering. It's the same for all of us in any moment. And it doesn't make my practice or anyone else's practice any more special. It is the capacity for steadiness we can build in every moment. And death, in some ways, is nothing special.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Making it special means that we give it a bigger status than it has. Of course, it's a big status. It's the end of our lives, or the lives of our loved one. But it's also part of the cycle of every day. And in every moment, we let go. We let this breath go. We let this sentence go that I perhaps didn't say skillfully, whatever, that we always want to claw back. It's a constant letting go.
Thank you for that wisdom. And reflecting back to our time at UMass and our teachers there, along with Florence Melio Myers and Melissa Blacker, we had the blessings of being with Jon Kabat-Zinn and Saki Santorelli. Is there anything in particular that you recall that you learned from Saki or Jon that you would like to acknowledge or express around what you just said or anything else? Yeah.
What I learned from Jon was not, I learned much from that, but actually what I'd like to share of what I learned from Jon was many years later. Jon, I was part of, I've been part of the founding group of the Mindfulness Institute and Institute for Mindfulness in South Africa. And at the time, in 2018, we had organized to bring Jon out for a visit. And, I organized the whole arrangements. We'd spent, of course, as one does, a whole year organizing these visits. I'd organized the time in Johannesburg for a talk and a retreat and a workshop. We'd had a whole visit with him in Cape Town where he'd done a whole lot more. And I was, we were traveling in Cape Town at the time when he got news that his mother-in-law was ill and in fact was dying at that time. And he'd known before and had let us know that things were uncertain. And then as we moved up to Johannesburg to have the rest of the teaching and his time in South Africa, he decided that he needed to really go back home and spend those last days with her. And we had to cancel the rest of that visit with him. And he said to me at that time, if I do not show up for my life in this moment and for my loved one as is needed and stay close to my own practice and override those needs for the needs of what I promised and for the visit here in South Africa, I'm not being true to my mindful practice, my calling, and my authenticity of showing up. I'm, of course, putting words into his mouth, not exactly after all these years what he said, but that was what the gist of what I've carried with me. And that's really, really stayed with me as an important teaching that we so often override what is needed in this moment in order to please, to do what's right. And it's so much more complicated than that. And so in every moment, there's a letting go, even of promises and even of assurances and checking back into what is really needed now for me, for those closest to me, for those I really care about. It wasn't a matter of life or death for us. It was a bunch of lectures and meetings that we, we could give refunds and show up and send out emails. And it was really, it's this capacity for discernment. What is the most important in this moment? And that's the lesson that I stay really close to, that I got from Jon over these years. But really, no matter how difficult that choice is of discernment, that's the one we need to make. And the lesson I got from Saki, I remember this was even before all the teacher training programs were, was a couple of years before that. I'd done my first 7-day training with Jon and Saki, and I really was completely new to mindfulness practice. I had very little experience with it. I was essentially pushed into it by my patience and my desire to connect to myself and to my medical practice in a different way. And I remember asking Saki at the end of that training about teaching and when could we start teaching, feeling uncertain. And one of the things that I remember is absolute faith that we needed to also learn how to trust in our capacities, to, of course, not be foolish and to do things that would not be beyond us, but to simply step out and try and test ourselves, and to test ourselves with a small group, within a place of safety and holding and concern for us, but that any development of our skills meant we needed to trust our capacity and really work with discomfort. Just go and do it. And so often we want to stay comfortable in attaining new skills. And we really can't attain any new skills when we stay comfortable. We have to learn to be uncomfortable, to make mistakes, to acknowledge them, to begin again. And I think over the years, that's something I've watched Saki do again and again, something I've learned from him and hold deeply.
Yeah, thank you. I remember hearing him say once, the danger isn't in being too big, it's in being too small. And this beautiful lesson from Jon, which I might paraphrase, another quote I recall, the most important thing is the next most important thing, and how you keep coming back and speaking to letting go to find that. And, letting go of wanting things to be different than the way they are to find that. Beautiful teaching that feels to me like it's really at the core heart of your practice. It's actually a good segue into relationships and what your experience might be to our relationship to grief and trauma, especially now as we're living through so many profound, challenging crises on this planet. What are your thoughts about our relationship to the grief and trauma of that on a personal level, as we see suffering in the ones we love that you just spoke towards addressing, as Jon addressed, and then also on a global planetary level that we're dealing with?
I think it's very hard. I think I'll address the big question first.
Sure. I'm asking
because in some ways, I think that's the easiest, because there's nothing, that to think about global catastrophes at such a big scale, it is overwhelming for us. It feels overwhelming to we're overwhelmed with our capacity to know so much these days, to have access to so much information, to be able to not, to find out in every country and in every community what kind of trauma and suffering they are living with. And so that's actually an impossible task and overwhelming. And so in many ways, I've come back to just small and local and personal. And the belief that what I do in this moment can have ripples, even as there's many interconnected and intersectional ripples. I have, family in multiple continents. I have friends all over the world. So I have all these interconnected ripples. And so struck by a couple things. So if you're okay, I'll work my way through them.
Take as much time as you'd like, Trish.
I was just recalling that I offered a very, very brief metta practice at the end of our meditation today. And it's a practice that really has kept me steady over the years. When I moved from South Africa when I left South Africa, which is now almost 10 years ago, I was going through a whole lot of changes in my life. I went through a family separation. I left a country I'd lived in for many years, not my birth country. I, left friends, family, a job. In fact, every kind of thing on that scale of disruption had happened to me pretty much, except my own death and someone close to me at the time. And so I went through a year of deep grief, trying to make sense of the choice I'd made, because I had made a choice. It wasn't something that had happened to me. I had made a choice, but with all things, we don't always understand our choices straight away. And so I spent a year really grieving and coming to terms with that. And it was loving kindness practice, really staying close in daily in every moment that helped me through that. And so just from my own experience of grief and suffering, in that moment, that struck me because it resonated just with something I offered today. That staying close in with a practice that we identify can be helpful in each moment. The other thing about trauma and suffering and meeting it, one of the things that I find that mindfulness practice brings for me, that has brought for me, and that I hope to help guide others into as I mentor or supervise, or with MBSR trainings and other work that I do, is that it's not that it changes our lives, but it gives us steadiness through the turmoil. And it's this staying really close to this steadiness that is helpful with trauma and suffering. My husband, Mick Krasner, and I helped co-facilitate with a dear friend and colleague this summer in Goma, DRC. We got a think tank grant from the Mind and Life for my colleague, who is really building from the grassroots a suicide prevention program that he would like to hold within a mindfulness frame. And that's a community that's been fraught with much suffering, that one thinks even at the climate catastrophe. It sits under this huge volcano that has an active lava basin that continues to refill. So it every few years overflows and has most recently 2 years ago. It goes through through war, through civil disruption, through access to resources, to water, electricity. There's multiple challenges like many of our community. And yet, while we were there, we were deeply inspired just by everybody stepping in and doing their part. What's needed for me? What is it that I'm needing to bring? And how do I work with this in community? And so I'm not sure I'm answering your question, because it's kind of an impossible question to ask in terms of how one works with trauma and grief and suffering. When one works in the way that one can best in any one moment. One sees if there's connection and community. That's something I've learned. And to be in relationship with someone. This for me, this place of intimacy with is what mindfulness practice is. It's a relational practice with myself and with others. And to understand that we're not alone in it.
It's a tall order, that question. So moving closer to home, even though it's really about the future that I'm most interested in, and how you see your place in mindfulness. You're teaching your students, your trainees, and the faculty at the university and in other places in developing the mindful quick pause.
One of my favorite projects at the moment is the Mindful Art Pause.
Love to hear about it.
It's a small, growing project that actually came out of this COVID environment that two colleagues of mine got together. In fact, one of my colleagues, Galen McCormack, who is at our music school at the Eastman School of Music here in Rochester, who is one of their faculty person, but also heads up our music in medicine. Performing, sorry, I must get this right. She heads up the performing arts in medicine program here at the university, at the hospital. So bringing performing arts into the hospital, and it's something that she's working. We have musical Fridays. She's been trying to get music into the wards or into the nurses. And so when she was furloughed early on in the pandemic, and just watching what was happening, especially for our healthcare workers, was very concerned about the nurses at the time and wanting to bring some relief to them. And so she spoke with a colleague of mine, Susan Deas, who does our visual arts and medicine program here, that also collaborates with our Memorial Art Gallery in town. That's another offshoot of part of the university. And they were putting together kind of image music pieces that they were offering to the nurses. And then Susan had she'd been one of our kind of guinea pig cohorts of doing an online mindfulness group, and said, really, we should bring in a mindfulness frame to this. So the three of us started collaborating, and we've put together now into our kind of second iteration of just piloting this. We've put together three small little 3-minute digital experiences where we have an image, and this is all because it's been still in-house. We have images that we curate from our art museum, musical pieces that have been recorded at the School of Music, and we put them into a digital package. And I've written for each of them a small meditation, and it kind of takes the arc of the 8 weeks. So we try and build it into the 8 week. And I've been really curious, do brief mindfulness, we know the research supports brief practice is helpful and can work. And so I'm interested, can a brief digital package on an 8 week arc that's not really curated in a group setting, although it is in groups. We're offering it to groups that do it together. They experience it the first day and then do it each day on their own. What happens with this? And it's fun. It's kind of fun to put these little packages together to decide what to do. Sometimes we add poetry or not. But it's really developing some of the things that is part of my growing practice is around research and scholarship. How can we look at with evaluating some of the work that we're doing? How can we write about it? How can we share it? And for this particular one, how can we research and outcomes for really brief practices and can they, not only do they have an internal shift, but I'm more and more interested in institutional, cultural, and systemic change. So mindfulness, of course, is an individual practice, but as we know, our individual suffering is really rooted in systemic and institutional and cultural injustices. And so that's where the work and the inquiry is for me, is if we do this in teams, does it change how we communicate? Does it change how we relate to our institutional practices? Does it do culture shift? That's really become my interest with my mindfulness work and with my other humanities work as well. Where is the context and culture shift happening?
Is there any public window into this work yet, or is it still very much in development?
Yeah. Not really.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to show you one, but then we'd have to start recording.
Okay.
Maybe when we're at the end, we'll show you a little thing. We have actually presented it at conferences. And so there's certainly some public offerings that are out there, but we're still not quite sure how to manage all the the crediting of all the work. Certainly the imaging and the music, that is not ours. So that always remains a struggle.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll stay tuned for that. So we did some work for the International Mindfulness Integrity Network, and we particularly did some work at looking at governance, or something on an international scale. That was a network holding standards and ethics for mindfulness teachers. And it leads me to my last question, which is, you touched on it just now a little bit about systemic institutional change, and particularly around governance and governments, and moving forward with our work and the influence kind of tied into the idea of decentralization a bit that takes place in the field of cryptocurrency, and it seems to be permeating society in different ways, and might happen even within the field of mindfulness, or is happening in the field of mindfulness, as things like this are emerging. I've just taken this and decentralized the ability to invite people and have something called Views from the Field. It's not part of any organization or institution. So the curiosity I have is your views around governance and any piece of what I just said around the movements around that you might see taking place in the world.
certainly with our work at the around integrity and staying close to standards for training and teaching MBSR teachers. Setting standards is important. It's important to keep things uniform. But it's important also to allow things to breathe and to grow and to develop over time, and to allow things to change. And so the frame with governance and with communities and with institutions, it's always fraught because one always is interested in who's making these choices and whose voices are being heard. And it's something that we're interested in the work in health humanities. I came to the health humanities because I was interested in learning more about the narrative medicine and the stories, because we were using those pieces in our mindfulness work with healthcare practitioners. And so I needed to learn more, and I kind of fell into a medical humanities degree and now into medical education. And part of that work in narrative medicine is being curious about stories and about whose voices are being heard and how stories are being told, who's listening, whose voice is present, how are they being co-created. And so it's about places of power. And I'm not sure we have answers, even if at a small level. So even for you, setting up this you have agency to set it up yourself. Absolutely. And there's it's beautiful that you've been able to have this forum for teachers to have a space to work. But any smaller group always, it has its own things about who's part of it and who's not part of it. Every bigger group is what voices control the bigger groups. So I don't think I have an answer, but I'm really watching at the moment this place of bias and perspective. And I've worked, in myself, really understanding my own bias and my own prejudice and my own, isms on every level that come up so quickly. I'm more curious, not that they're present because I know they're present, but how quickly they always come up. And so for me, I don't think I have an answer for you because it's just watching where these things are, but really being carefully attuned to the practices of insight and awareness and perspective, and noting our tendency to in-group and out-group very quickly. I find myself in a confusion stage of my life, which means that there's a lot percolating. There's a lot that I'm interested in about this context of governance, of structure, of power, of lines of influence, and how an individual, you as an individual, me as an individual, all of us, what are the choices we make? Who do we take with us, and how open and inclusive are we? And it's not up to me. I may be the one that has to step back. Sometimes we step back and it's others. It's about, I think at this point in my career, my role is to mentor others and to really be purposeful around mentorship and mentoring other leaders. And that my time is done. It's about supervision, mentoring, supporting others in their role and elevating their voices.
That's the prime directive of these sessions and the intention. And I think you've lived up to it today within the big questions. And I feel I can ask those questions of you, one, because I feel close to you. I know you. I know I won't offend you with it. And you've been a beautiful teacher for me, Trish. And I learn from you from asking these kind of big questions always. So just heartfelt thank you for being here, especially, knowing you're not feeling 100% today. You've done what you've lived, you've embodied what you have said earlier, that this is the practice and we show up, if I can paraphrase it. So thank you for being here, and many blessings. We'll look forward to our next meeting.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for asking me, and always a pleasure. I'm deeply honored.
Click down below to join our Mindfulness Teacher Community Network on Facebook, where you are invited to post and share. Also, subscribe to Sing to the Mountain Studio. Ring the bell so you don't miss out on future recordings.